Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sharath Toopran, and I'm the co-founding partner at Arkvega Partners. Over the next 35 minutes or so, I'll be serving as your moderator for this panel, discussion on risk, growth, and benchmarks for the global investors as part of the SMS 2024. We'll try to keep this a free-flowing discussion, and I know we're running a little bit late, so we'll try to sort of keep it as concise as possible. And let me sort of quickly introduce our four panelists today. First off, Hemendra Mathur. Hemendra is a venture partner at Bharat Innovation Fund and co-founder at Think AG. Sits on boards of dozens of startups and is someone who's extensively looked at the convergence of deep tech and food tech. So thank you, Hemendra, for joining.
Thank you.
Next, we have Sid Jain. Sid Jain is the founder and CEO of Biomeg Asia Pacific, a boutique consultancy based in Singapore and Melbourne. Specialist in food, agribusinesses, and nutrition. Comes with 20 plus years of experience in helping food companies scale up. So thank you, Sid. I mean, those are valuable experiences you have. Third, we have Joshua Errett. He was the co-founder of BioCraft, the world's first cultivated meat company. He's currently with Cult Food Science, which is the first publicly traded company pioneering investment and commercialization of cultivated products. So breadth of knowledge on how the product and the business side of things sort of come together. Thank you, Josh, for joining. I know it's a little odd hour for you, so thank you for your time. And finally, we have Aadil Chitalwala from Peak Sustainability Ventures, early stage climate investing VC fund in India. Energy, water, climate, and of course food, which Aadil leads. And Peak has made several investments globally in the wider sustainability space, extensive knowledge understanding the sector from a global lens. So thank you, Aadil.
Thanks for having me.
So we have four very strong professional guys and who understand this space from various vantage points. And with those introductions out of the way, I'd like to jump right in and sort of start off with Hemendra. Hemendra, I want to begin by getting a very general view on how you're seeing the broader early stage VC investment landscape in India, right? And more specifically on the food tech and deep tech side of things. And I'm taking the liberty of putting cultivated meat in sort of the deep tech bucket. But how do you sort of view it?
Right. No, thanks, Sharath, and thanks, ClearMeat, for this opportunity. Yeah, I think it's a very exciting space. I know we are going through some sort of funding winter, but for the right reasons, valuations are getting corrected. And thankfully, funding winter has led to more bottom line focus than sort of growth at any cost kind of model. So I think this is good times. Clearly, deep tech is emerging as a sector of focus. Government of India has come up with a deep tech policy. We see a bunch of deep tech funds in India, which is interesting. And I think anything which is cutting across food tech, deep tech, climate tech is of a lot of interest. And thankfully, cultivated meat, cell-based meat sit right at the center of it. So I think it is good times. I think there are a couple of things which I want to share which is very important for investors to invest in this sector. First, the positioning of cell-based meats. I think it's not very well understood. Who are the target customers? A lot of people confuse plant-based meat and plant-based food with cultivated meat. How do you bring that differentiation? And how do you position it as a more sustainable, climate-friendly, nutritious food? I think along with the taste, because when it comes to food, 90% of the decision is around taste. So I think that positioning needs to be sort of cleared up a bit more among consumer, and that can possibly drive scale, which can be of investor interest. I think secondly, cost of making cultivated meat. I think that itself is on the higher side right now, and we need to figure out how do we bring that down, right from cell lines, media culture, cost of bioprocess design and bioreactors which are used in the manufacturing. How do we make it more affordable? How do we make it really, because when it comes, my guess is a lot of non-vegetarians may switch to cell-based meat, but if the price difference is more than, let's say, 20-25%, is going to be a big challenge. So to me, cost restructuring or sort of bringing costs down is a challenge and an opportunity for a lot of startups in this space. I'll stop here and pass it on.
No, I totally resonate with that. And we did have a funding winter last year. I mean, investments were down, but things are looking good. With that, Joshua, I want to sort of bring you in, and it segues nicely into the problem statement here. you've been involved directly in the business of cultivated meat, right? Is there a need for it? I mean, what is the underlying problem statement here? Do traditional meat sourcing practices need to be reassessed? Like, what are we trying to solve here?
First of all, thanks for having me. I appreciate the invite, and I love talking about this. So yeah, I think that question you just asked was the question that brought on the existential idea of what we're doing in this industry. And it started in the plant-based industry, where all of a sudden you know consumers woke up to the fact they were paying more, and the nutritional benefit for the consumer was a little bit unclear.
Mhm.
And that was, you know, part of the disinformation campaign from Big Meat. But you know, you went to the store and you wondered why you were paying, you know, so much more for hamburger than you previously were. And I think that kind of came over to the cultivated side, and it was like, okay, so what is it here? What is the problem, as you put it? And you had the disinformation as well, talking about, well, you know, the climate effects aren't that bad when you look at other things, and you look at all the ingredients, and you look at the energy output that goes into cultivated meat, and there started to be some confusion about the sustainability. So really, I think at this point, there's two factors that I like to focus on. One is nutrition. It has to be 10x of what the farmed meat equivalent is right now. It has to have discernible qualities that you can't get from farmed meat, and that the consumer can see. And then number two, you know, the pandemic was a shock, to say the least, to everything, including our food system. And I think it'll take one more shock like that before the world wakes up to, you know, mass agriculture as we know it today, and how it can't work and needs to evolve.
Yeah.
And the idea also that, you know, the problem statement is such that the cultivated industry came out and saying, well, we're going to replace farmed animals. We're going to replace factory farming, wipe it out. You know, we're the new game in town. And that has to be kind of adjusted as well. And the idea, I think, should be we are going to right size factory farming, bring it down to a level that doesn't have such devastating environmental effects,
Yeah.
and not eliminate it, and eliminate actually the talk of eliminating it. So just bring it down to a smaller level, and, you know, offer the nutritional benefits, and then watch out for that shock coming, the next pandemic, which could come from farmed animals.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's sort of
Sharath, if this is said, if I can contribute and just add on to what Joshua said, I think when you look at some of the markets like Japan, and particularly fishing, there is a lot of concern around fish stocks, the way fishing is carried out, the way wild type fishes are captured and have a role in the food systems at you know, in some of the countries. So cultivated meat, I think, is not just around the farm animal management, the disease management, but those kind of sustainability problems, you know, helping address that protein gap, I think is also a tool where cultivated meat kind of comes in. You know.
And Sid, you know, I'll follow that up. Yes, that there's a protein gap and there's a problem statement here. From, you know, to address that, I mean, we have to sort of build a food tech company and commercialize and scale up, which addresses the protein gap at the same time meets the sustainability mandates that we are chasing. What can you just throw some light on sort of the cost economics side of things, and how big a scientific challenge is it when you marry it with the commercial challenge of building a scalable model on one side, but at the same time also sort of mimicking the texture or taste of traditional meat? And how do you sort of go about scaling such a value proposition?
I mean, look, Sharath, from my vantage point, which has been predominantly looking at it from a Singapore and a US perspective with some of the companies that are investing in the space, I think the opportunity is really number one to understand, as Hemendra said, the value prop, the regulatory environment. You know, what is the regulatory framework in any country to registers cell-based meat. Now, different countries are following different regimes. US has shown its its prowess in terms of approving 3 of the companies. Singapore has approved 1. There is work going on in Thailand and Japan. I think it'd be great to see India also understanding India on what is India's regulatory position on cell-based meat. That's point 1. Point 2, on scalability, I think 2023 was definitely a tough year where we saw a lot of tourist capital move away from the cell-based industry, because some of that tourist capital recognize the long-term risks, recognize that CapEx is required to build capacity in those biofermenters. And again, I feel in a way that's a good opportunity for consolidation, which probably you'll talk about. But more importantly, yes, those bioreactors are important, but we don't expect every startup to invest in CapEx to build bioreactors. I think there needs to be some public-private partnerships to provide that kind of infrastructure where the technology companies can come in with their capabilities and leverage that infrastructure. So I think that piece of scaling up a shared responsibility, private-public sector, will definitely help in bringing the cost down, and regulatory on top of it is the key enabler.
Yeah, no, makes sense. And Aadil, I'd like to sort of get a sustainability.
Yeah, no, I'll just kind of add on to that as well. I think kind of Sid raised a pretty important point, which is the fact that, I mean, cultivated meat, because of kind of the way Hemendra put it, right, fitting between food tech and deep tech, requires a very good understanding of what exactly is going on, right? It's not something as simple as, I mean, forgive those of those in the audience focusing on this, but plant-based in comparison is a lot more simple than kind of everything required to go into cultivated meat, right? And the fact of the matter is that, and this is kind of where I think events like this are absolutely very crucial, because I think everyone, to a certain extent, all the speakers here have pointed out the lack of consumer awareness around this, right? And consumer awareness also kind of has a big decision driver for what investors end up putting capital into as well, right? Unless that scalability factor is prominent and an investor can kind of really fit that into the investment rationale, there's no way they're deploying capital into it, right? So that's definitely something that, because you saw this funding winter happen, because you had like exploratory, or as Sid put it, like tourism capital sort of, drain out of areas that are less understood, like cultivated meat, you're now kind of starting to see also, as Hemendra was talking about, a focus on bottom lines, but you're also starting to see people who are diving into understanding the fundamentals of what it takes for an industry like cultivated meat kind of scale, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the opportunity that we're at right now, is kind of building that understanding from the ground up. Right?
Yeah. And I want to sort of ask you as well, specifically, Aadil, is because you're a sustainability focused VC fund, right? How do you sort of gauge those sustainability metrics? What is the framework of thinking? I mean, there is obviously, from a traditional VC and investment standpoint, it's sort of higher P&L, higher profitability, and sort of get a 10x return on investment. But from a sustainability factor, what are those markers that you typically look for and impact? And I want to sort of also talk about, there's climate, there's food, there's energy, there's water. And there is some sort of correlation between all of them, right? I mean, when you talk about cultivated meat, people also talk about how much less water it uses. I mean, so how do you sort of look at it from a very consolidated lens?
Yeah, I mean, there is a proper answer to that, which I can take up the entire session for. But to put it like very simply, I think as you very rightly put it, right, it is, so I mean, food does not operate independently, right? It has a huge role to play, both in terms of water consumed, as well as the role that energy plays in terms of global emissions as well. Most people kind of I mean, I think that dialogue has been evolving now, but even the role of scope 3 emissions and sort of when it comes to the food system space, right? I think for us particularly, I think it all starts from, I think everyone is kind of familiar with the resource intensity and the resource burden that the traditional agriculture sector has, particularly when it comes to meat, right? And this is, I think, for most VCs, whether you're just sort of general or deep tech focused fund or climate tech like us, that's kind of where all sort of theses fall from. And for us, particularly when you're comparing different alternatives to the traditional agricultural supply chain, right? What is the impact being created here, right? How much water are we saving? How much resources are we saving? How much land are we saving? That's kind of where it all starts from. And then secondly, it kind of comes down to, okay, you know that India's population being what it is, right? We have one of the largest non-vegetarian populations on the planet, right? What is the delta between the non-vegetarian population that consumes traditional meat versus the non-vegetarian population that might consume substitute like cultivated meat, right? And I think you've had a situation where right now, because of the way cultivated meat is priced, they are catering to the top of the market, right? You've had companies that are now partnering with Michelin star restaurants and all of that as well, right? But I think the question sort of comes down to, with a population like us, right? What is the opportunity that is required to kind of bring the cost down, as Hemendra was kind of pointing out, and what will it take in terms of resources for us to sort of bring that cost down, right? I think something that Clear Meat does, is an example, is they kind of focus on replacing fetal bovine serum, right? Now, most people don't really understand the role the fetal bovine serum plays across the board, right? So just looking at the long-term impact of that and the larger picture impact of that has a big kind of role to play in the decision that we make as we're kind of evaluating investments, right?
Yeah. Hemendra, I'm just want to sort of stretch that a little bit. Listen, this is a very tough market, or a very tough business to sort of look at from a VC standpoint, right? I mean, how do you look at the risk reward profile? I mean, and even valuation standpoint, right? You can't just slap a sales multiple on it and say this business is worth. I mean, a lot of these are pre-revenue, right? How does a VC think of before even investing in this sector?
Right. So if you look at the sectors which have kind of scaled in India, be it e-com or fintech or SaaS, look at all of this started with the building of an ecosystem, which created the pathways to success and scale, right? I think Clear Meat is, as in the cultivated meat is somewhere there. We need to build a very strong ecosystem before we sort of start hitting the VC doors. That's my understanding. And I think what Clear Meat is doing is a great sort of contribution to build that ecosystem. You need the, you need, of course, smart biotech people who can work on it. You need strong R&D institutions. You need Department of Biotech. You need laboratories which are very good at synthetic biology, right? You need computational sort of applications expert, right? Who can reduce your permutation and combination and hopefully the cost of development. You need people from the food services industries, as Aadil was saying, it's not just the Michelin star restaurants who's going to consume it, but is Horeca ready for it? Are they willing to serve this kind of food? And if yes, how do you work with them? You need people who understand consumer behavior. What will it take for people to adopt this product at scale? So I think we are somewhere there right now where we're trying to figure out that ecosystem, which can sort of hopefully generate quite a few interesting startups like what Clear Meat is today. Probably we have a few dozen right now. Maybe it should be in few hundreds, in my opinion, for VCs to become seriously inclined to look at this space, because it as VCs who's getting 5 deals a day, the bandwidth is so limited, and as some of the panelists have put it, to understand the space is a PhD thesis in itself. So how do you create that critical mass and build enough thesis around it is going to be very important. I think very frankly, VCs are interested, but I think someone has to educate them for investments.
I'd like to sort of, I want to get Sid first and then Josh. I know, Sid, you're sort of short on time. When you've sort of worked extensively in Singapore and sort of Southeast Asian markets, right? And you loosely alluded to as well, there is, in fact, Shiok and Umami Bioworks, I think they sort of merged as well. So, I mean, it seems like it's slightly more evolved than where we are in India right now. Are there any food tech plays that you have sort of, you've looked at closely, and are there any learnings that one can take from? That's point number one. And second, I also want to sort of get, when you work with companies which are in the wider food tech ecosystem, are they looking at, cell-based meat or even alternate meat as a real growth lever or the next big thing or something that they're deploying internal resources? Is that sort of narrative being built?
Yeah, no, great question, Sharath. So the first one, look, I think if I look at the investments or at least the focus of the governments in Singapore and let's say areas of Middle East, the sovereign funds, Temasek, the Abu Dhabi funds, they are taking very aggressive positions as equity investors in some of the startups that are in various stages of cell meat development. And I think that's driven by a concern, definitely post-COVID, around food security. Now, I know India is also very concerned about food security, and the government does have policies, but having, I think, a food security agenda where cell meat can be a contributor to that agenda, I think would be a very good impetus to companies like Clear Meat and others in India, because that means that under food security, it is defined as a priority. I think this is something that the Middle East and Singapore have done well. And that has really incentivized a lot of companies from Israel, like LF Farms, some of the local startups like Shiok and Umami you spoke about, and some of the US startups to also look at applying for registration and bringing the product first into Southeast Asia in parallel to the US market. So I think that's probably a key learning. It is the food security angle, the government focus, and kind of an incentive for the startups to know that they're not working alone. They have got certain support within their home environment and in a big market like India.
Yeah.
That's point one. Point two, on what I have seen, look, I think Hemendra talked about the ecosystem. So having the VCs together with the strategics, together with the players in the value chain. Good example is the Cargills and the ADMs investing in a perfect day, investing in an upside food. You need the Indian corporates to be party to this ecosystem. They will bring their network, and they will also start thinking about the sustainability angle of go-to-market. So in the investments that I know, you would have the sovereign funds like Temasek, you would have folks like ADM or Cargill, but then you also have a Nestle or a Thai Union, or a CP Group from Thailand, or a CJ Group from Korea, or a Mitsubishi from Japan as party to it, so that it becomes not just a play for the VCs, but you have people who've got a vested interest in making it happen. So that's some food for thoughts.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. And Josh, I obviously want to get an American perspective as well, but I also want to sort of talk about two more adjacent use cases which you'd understand. One, we've seen majority capital till now get behind plant-based meat. I think more than 2 billion has been invested in that sector. That second is, there's plant-based food on one side. Now, you've done a bunch of work in making cultivated meat solutions as pet food as well. Now, do you see pet food and plant-based food and then cell-based food, do you view them as parallel markets which are going to flourish parallelly, or do you view pet market as some kind of a validation before you sort of project it as a human consumption market? How do you see all these three things sort of evolve as a portfolio?
That's a great question. I want to totally agree with the previous points on food security and other industry players and kind of segmenting the ecosystem. Very true. Agree wholeheartedly. And I think the food security thing is going to be something that everyone's going to keep coming back to cultivated meat. I don't know, maybe some people have left, maybe they're tourists, maybe they'll be back. I just wanted to enter that idea into the stream that some of the people who were here and got scared and left will be back, because this is an ongoing problem. The solution has not presented itself. The problem is still there. So we may come back to this. On the idea of pet food and some auxiliary markets as well, I love those for the simple reason that there's really one food system. And we've had the glut of startups, especially in the US, focus on the kind of the center of the plate, the heart of the American diet, which is, steak, hamburgers, plant-based as does the same thing. Whereas when you look at the animal industry, it touches everything. It touches foods across the spectrum, foods you can buy at convenience stores, pet foods, foods you give your infants. It's everywhere. So to just focus on the one kind of, indeed, the hardest for several reasons, part of the food system, I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense. I understand that why people are going for it, because that's where the market is. But when you look at going for a steak in the US and trying to recreate that, I mean, steak's not a popular one, but let's say the hamburger, that's a kind of an all-American classic dish, kind of tied in with masculinity, tied in with cultural events. It's going to be a tough one to dislodge immediately. So I always have been a proponent of going for something lower on the totem pole, lower the stakes, in terms, not the stake animal, but the gambling stakes, lower the criteria, and the importance of what you're trying to create, what food stuff you're trying to create. And I think you can get easier customers that way. The key has been brought up several times in this chat is economics, unit economics. But I think there's low-hanging fruit that exists outside of the center of the plate, outside dinner at all, or lunch, or main meat products somewhere where we're not looking, is perhaps the key.
No, makes sense. Aadil, want to get your take as well, because you obviously got exposure in global markets and have done some work there as well. Is there a contrast that you see with how this sector will evolve from strictly a consumer standpoint? Is the average Western consumer versus an average Indian consumer, how will they perceive lab-based meat? Do you see any stark differences in terms of how it might sort of be perceived? And India is typically the kind of meat that the Indian consumer has accepts freely, or fish, chicken, and mutton, and those are the three most popular meats. And how do you sort of view that discrepancy between the West and probably the Indian consumer market?
Yeah, I mean that I think that's where there are sort of lessons for cultivated meat from the way plant-based sort of responded as well, right? I think when it comes to like just alternative protein in general, I think a lot of Western consumers are kind of a lot more open to the idea of kind of again, going back to consumer awareness, going back to consumer education. They are a lot more aware of the benefits, kind of realize, right? And I think that's something that really helped kind of boom that initial wave of plant-based when it came about, right? I think your Beyond Meats and Impossible Foods and all of that kind of really rode on that whole wave. I think it's also another aspect is that, I think security has been mentioned a fair bit already, but we've seen a number of, sort of homegrown cultivated meat companies in some of these more Western countries or some of the more developed countries as well, right? Which I think also plays a role in some aspect, right?
Yeah.
In India, in comparison, just given where regulation is, given sort of where the Indian consumer is, we are facing a situation where Indian companies have had to like go outside, prove themselves, and then sort of come back, right? That presents both like pros and cons. One, it creates that third-party validation for the Indian consumer that, hey, okay, if a Western consumer in Singapore and the US likes this product, then yes, an Indian consumer will also kind of be favorable towards it. But the second, I mean, on the other hand as well, I think Indian consumers now kind of also believe that, hey, our taste and our decision making is very different from sort of what the Western markets are like, right?
Yeah.
So I think specifically for cultivated meat, I think what needs to kind of work for the consumer to sort of get up to speed on kind of where they are a few things, right? One is talking. I think the health wave has sort of become quite relevant for India. I think with plant-based as well. Most sort of plant-based companies are now kind of really positioning themselves as sort of the healthy alternative rather than the sustainable alternative, which is what's working. I think that's something that the cultivated meat industry is going to need to do as well, right? And I think given the ability of being flexible with the product that's being made in the cultivated meat industry, that's something that they actually can have a much larger impact on than even their plant-based counterparts, right? So I think being able to sort of tap into that particular market segment is going to play a huge role in sort of building confidence within the Indian consumer, and then kind of having a follow through with the larger market as well. I think secondly, I think you have started to see like the government sort of also putting its own sort of initiatives behind cultivated meat, right? You now have a Department of Biotechnology, you have like a fisheries industry, center in Mumbai around cultivated seafood, right? So the government has kind of issued grants towards like the Aadil Incubation Center for cultivated meat, all of right. So I think that in itself is also sort of giving the Indian consumer a lot of confidence that hey, this is something that since the government is sort of behind and the government is launching initiatives, it's something we should actually consider, right?
Yeah.
Those are things that kind of definitely come a long way. I think with more sustainability sectors, the role of the government, at least in these initial stages, will play a very big role, right? And kind of based on how people react to that, you'll see the consumers becoming more and more favorable, right? Which is very different from the way Singapore and the US have kind of evolved, because I think consumers have just been more open to kind of trying new things. India, for all things, and like you said, right, there are 3 main meats that we kind of go to, and they've been there for decades, right? We're not really, we're a very sort of risk-averse sort of a community when it comes to things we consume. But yeah.
And sort of we're running out of time, but I do definitely, our panels such as this, I do want to talk a little bit, Hemendra, get your views on. I know it's very early days for this ecosystem, but I still would like to get some thoughts on what business models that you see might crop up in this place. And broadly speaking, right, when we look at businesses, there's a B2B side where you sort of license out your tech or maybe even the sell medium here and let people build brands around it. And the other one is to sort of go direct to consumer and create like a cell-based cultivated meat brand, which typical VCs will say comes with higher CACs, it's more difficult to build. There are different ways to look at it. What do you think? Any thoughts there on where we might see the first businesses come up?
Sure. I think that's a very good question. And if you look at the Indian food consumption, it's probably around $800 to $900 billion. So almost, I would say, $550 to $600 billion is anyway plant-based food, right? So India is not new to that. Of course, it is not positioned as meat substitute. That's a different thing,
Yeah.
But anyway, we are even the hardcore non-vegetarians eat a lot of vegetarian food in India, right? Another $150 to $200 billion is dairy and milk-based proteins, and maybe $50 to $100 billion animal proteins, right? So I think from a business model perspective, I think one should be very clear. Goes back to what I said earlier, how you're positioning sell meat. To me, clearly non-vegetarians who really care about environment, sustainability, probably is a good target segment, right? Now, the question is, will they pay 5% more, 10% more, 100% more? That's something we should figure out. And that's where the unit economics become very, very important. Secondly, I would say the vegetarians who are shifting to non-vegetarian food, probably they could be targeted, right? Typically they start with eggs and some chicken, etc. But I think cell-based meats can be positioned as the first meat for someone who's shifting to non-veg. And I think the third segment, which I probably am most excited about, is this millennials and Gen Z. I think among all the customer segment that I have seen, probably this segment really cares about environment. They really care about sustainability. And I think they are much more experimental than people of my age, right? So I would sort of, get that positioning right. But having said that, I think the bottom line is nutrition, good protein, and a promise to the consumer that it is sustainably produced. Look what happened to organic foods in India. Despite being a high potential, high impact, high growth category, it never grew beyond $1 billion, $2 billion, because that trust factor was missing with consumers. So I think how do you build trust with customers on the claims that it is sustainably produced is going to be very, very critical for the success of this category. My guess is initially more B2B than B2C, because B2B is not just about product development. It is all about your position, how do you market, and I think it takes a lot of time and money to build consumer brands. But having said, I'm sure something will come out of it. But initially B2B and maybe an export opportunity. If we can make something at, let's say, 30% less than what Singapore is making or what US is making, then we are in very good position to export some of these products from India to some of these markets which are really have adopted this meat at scale. So that's my some initial takes on it, of course.
No, makes a lot of sense, and I think we fully resonate with the point that the new generation does value sustainable practices significantly more, and I think we all sort of agree. I mean that we are at the infancy of this sector. I mean, from even the Western world included. I mean, there's a steep growth runway here, and obviously building cost economics around it and sort of building sustainable businesses is going to be what we look out for. And I think that is sort of, we've covered a fair bunch of ground, and I think that is our time limit. I mean, thank you, Clear Meat, for setting up this panel, and thank you, Hemendra, Joshua, Aadil, and Sid for taking the time out and sharing your insights. I mean, this was very helpful, and we'll close the discussion here.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
Sharath. It was great.
Yeah, thank you. Nice chatting.
Thanks.